Hello class, and welcome to the Chapter 2 review. I've been very pleased with the responses so far, so keep up the good work. And I know that Chapter 2 can be a tough read because of all the names and dates, but it's important to understand the history of management so we know where we've been and how we got here today. Now, let's get into the wildly important goals for this chapter. As we've learned from Chapter 2, management ideas and practices have actually been used since about 5000 BC. And as we've advanced in society and technology, work shifted from families to factories, from skilled laborers to specialized unskilled laborers. The Industrial Revolution dramatically changed jobs and organizations. Now unskilled laborers running machines began to replace high-paid skilled artisans. With the Industrial Revolution came a different type of worker. Because employees were less vested in the quality of their product or job, many companies began to struggle with efficiency. For the first time in history, we start to see a big shift into studies about the quality, efficiency, and training of workers. One such manager, Frederick Taylor, devises a system he calls the scientific management, which managers follow 4 management principles. First is part of the planning function of management, and that's to study each element of work to determine the best way to do it. The second, we're going to scientifically select, train, teach, and develop our workers to reach their full potential. That is the foundation for our hiring and interviewing process. Third, cooperate with employees to ensure that the scientific principles are implemented. This is part of our leading and monitoring function of management. Now finally, dividing the work and responsibility equally between management and workers is part of the organizing function. So you can see just how far Taylor was for his times, as these functions are all used today. Today, when we hear about bureaucracy, we think of red tape, delays, and inefficiencies. But when Max Weber first introduced the idea of bureaucracy in his organization, it was completely necessary. You have to consider that during this time, monarchies and wealthy families ran these companies, and they would often employ their children or spouse or best friend to run things. The problem, of course, is that major decisions were based on family connections, personal gain, or simply resulted from somebody having a bad day. So Weber decides that the best way to prevent this in his organization is through bureaucracy. Now, around this same time in France, Henry Fayot develops the 5 management functions of planning, organizing, coordinating, commanding, and controlling. Of course, we now know these as our 4 functions of management: planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. Conflict is bad, right? Wrong. Conflict is neither bad or good. Our reaction to conflict is what makes it good or bad. Mary Parker Follett believed that it should be embraced rather than avoided. Now, she believed that integrative conflict resolution was the best resolution because it focuses on both parties working together to find an alternative that meets the needs of both parties. Now, around this time, the Hawthorne studies was being conducted, and they're an important time in the history of human relations because not what it intended to discover, but rather what it accidentally uncovered. The Hawthorne studies discovered social norms within an organization. It demonstrated that workers' feelings and attitudes affected their work, and it also discovered that financial incentives aren't necessarily the most important motivators for workers. The Hawthorne studies taught us that group norms and behavior play a critical role in behavior at work. Chester Bernard, who was president of then New Jersey Bell Telephone Company, took this a step further and looked at the critical importance of willing cooperation in organizations. In general, Bernard argued that people will be indifferent to managerial directives or orders as long as they understand them, they're consistent, they're compatible with a person's personal interests or beliefs, and they can actually be carried out by these people. So it's important to remember that acceptance of authority is not automatic. There is a willing cooperation between employee and employer. This last section of the chapter focuses on 4 approaches that we've seen evolve out of the impact of the Industrial Revolution. The operations management, which uses a quantitative or mathematical approach to find ways to increase productivity, is best represented by the standardized and interchangeable parts in a manufacturing industry. The ability for an organization to put out standard and uniform parts led to an increase in productivity and efficiency for many companies during this time. Information management is about adopted technologies that help reduce the cost or maybe even increase the speed at which they can acquire, store, retrieve, or communicate information. Remember that information management is about data, specifically the speed and availability of data. Some of the most important technologies that have revolutionized information management were the invention of the printing press in the 14th and 15th centuries, the manual typewriter in the 1850, the telephone in the 1880s, the personal computer in the 1980s, and finally the internet in the 1990s. Systems management is a system that can be defined as a set of interrelated elements or parts that function as a whole. Managers and workers use their management knowledge and manufacturing techniques to transform inputs into outputs. Organizational systems must also address the issue of synergy and open versus closed systems. Now finally, with all these different theories and studies, we find a contingency approach, which actually states that there is no universal management theory. The most effective management theory or idea depends on the kinds of problems or situations that managers or organizations are facing at a particular time. Simply put, management is much harder than it looks, and often your interactions will define which approach is best to use for any given situation. So those were our chapter 2 wildly important goals. You guys have done a great job. I'm very impressed with what I've seen so far, so keep up the good work. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or call me.